What happens when one of Hollywood's most respected actors walks onto a talk show expecting a conversation and instead gets ambushed with disrespect? In just 32 seconds, a single comment would turn a simple interview into one of the most explosive moments in late-night television history. This is the story of the night Samuel L. Jackson sat down with Greg Gutfeld, and everything fell apart. The lights were bright in the studio. The audience was ready. Samuel L. Jackson walked out onto the stage with that calm confidence he's known for. He'd done 1,000 interviews before. This was supposed to be easy. Just another night promoting his latest film, talking about his career, maybe sharing a few laughs. He settled into the guest chair, straightened his jacket, and smiled at the cameras. Greg Gutfeld sat across from him, grinning in that way that made you wonder what he was thinking. The show had just started. The crowd was clapping. Everything seemed normal. "Welcome to the show," Gutfeld said, leaning back in his chair like he owned the world. "Thanks for being here." "Happy to be here," Samuel replied, nodding politely. But there was something in Gutfeld's eyes, something that suggested this wasn't going to be the friendly chat Samuel had signed up for. "So," Gutfeld began, shuffling some note cards on his desk, "you've been in the business a long time, done a lot of movies, action films, dramas, all that. Tell me something. Do you ever get tired of playing the same kind of character over and over again?" Samuel paused. It was a strange way to start an interview. Most hosts opened with softballs, easy questions that made guests feel comfortable. This felt different. "I wouldn't say I play the same character," Samuel said carefully. "Every role is different. Every script brings something new." Gutfeld nodded, but his smile didn't reach his eyes. Sure. But I mean, come on. Tough guy with a gun. Tough guy who's angry. Tough guy who yells a lot. It's kind of your thing, right?" The audience shifted uncomfortably. A few people laughed nervously. Samuel's expression didn't change, but you could see something flicker across his face. Annoyance, maybe? Or disbelief? "I think that's a pretty narrow way to look at my work," Samuel said, his voice still calm, but with an edge now. "I've played teachers, coaches, dramatic roles, comedic roles. I've got range." "Oh, I'm sure you do," Gutfeld said, waving his hand dismissively. "I'm just saying, when people think of Samuel L. Jackson, they think of a guy yelling and shooting things. That's the brand, right?" Samuel sat up a little straighter. The brand is good acting. The brand is showing up, doing the work, and telling stories that matter to people. Gutfeld smirked. "Stories that matter. Okay. Like what? Superhero movies? Comic book stuff? I mean, let's be real. You're not exactly doing Shakespeare out there." The audience went quiet. This was crossing a line. You could feel it in the room. Samuel L. Jackson had been nothing but professional, and here was the host, basically insulting his entire career to his face. "I've done plenty of serious work," Samuel said, his voice getting harder now. "But there's nothing wrong with entertaining people either. Movies don't have to be miserable to be meaningful." Right, Gutfeld said, leaning forward with that same condescending grin. "Entertainment. That's one word for it. Some people might call it selling out, but hey, everyone's got bills to pay." Samuel stared at him. The atmosphere in the studio had completely changed. What started as an interview now felt like a confrontation. The crew behind the cameras looked uncomfortable. The audience didn't know whether to laugh or stay silent. "Selling out," Samuel repeated slowly. "Is that what you think I've been doing for 40 years? "I'm not saying that," Gutfeld replied, though his tone suggested he absolutely was saying that. "I'm just asking questions. That's what we do here. We have conversations. We push back a little. You can handle that, right?" "I can handle a conversation," Samuel said. "What I don't appreciate is someone disrespecting my work when they clearly haven't taken the time to understand it." Gutfeld laughed. Actually laughed. "Oh, I understand it. Believe me, you show up, You say some lines, you cash a check. It's not complicated. That was it. That was the moment. Samuel's jaw tightened. His hands gripped the armrests of his chair. He was done playing nice. You know what? Samuel said, his voice low and controlled. I came here thinking this was going to be a respectful interview. I thought we were going to talk about my film, my career, maybe have some fun. But instead, you've spent the last 5 minutes trying to tear me down for no reason. I'm not tearing you down, Gutfeld protested, still smiling like this was all a game. I'm just being honest. People appreciate honesty. Honesty? Samuel's voice rose slightly. You call this honesty? You're sitting there, smug as hell, acting like you know anything about what it takes to do what I do. You think it's easy? You think showing up on set at 5 in the morning, working 14-hour days, learning lines, hitting marks, bringing characters to life, you think that's just cashing a check? The audience started murmuring. Some people clapped. They were on Samuel's side, and it was obvious. Gutfeld shifted in his seat, clearly not expecting this level of pushback. Hey, I'm just saying what a lot of people think. No, Samuel shot back. You're saying what you think. And frankly, I don't care what you think. You sit behind this desk and make jokes and act superior. But what have you actually done? What have you created? What have you built? Gutfeld's smile finally faded. I have a show. A successful show. A show where you insult your guests, Samuel said. Real impressive. The tension was thick enough to cut. The cameras were still rolling. Nobody knew what to do. This had gone completely off the rails. Look, Gutfeld said, trying to regain control. Maybe we got off on the wrong foot here. Let's talk about your new movie. That's why you're here, right? I'm not here to be disrespected, Samuel said firmly, and I'm definitely not here to sit and listen to you belittle everything I've worked for. I think you're being a little sensitive, Gutfeld replied, and that was the biggest mistake he could have made. Samuel stood up. Just stood right up out of his chair. The audience gasped. Gutfeld's eyes went wide. Sensitive, Samuel repeated, staring down at the host. You bring me on your show. You insult my career. You mock my work. And when I call you out on it, I'm being sensitive? Sit down, Gutfeld said, his voice losing its cocky edge. We're in the middle of a show. Your show, Samuel said. Not mine. I don't have to be part of this. The producer was frantically gesturing from off stage, trying to figure out what to do. The audience was completely silent now, watching this unfold in real time. You can't just leave, Gutfeld said, standing up himself now. We're live. Watch me, Samuel said. This is ridiculous, Gutfeld protested. You're acting like a child. That was it. The final straw. Samuel L. Jackson, one of the most professional actors in Hollywood, was being called a child on live television by a host who had done nothing but provoke him since the moment he sat down. A child, Samuel said quietly, dangerously. I've been in this business longer than you've been on television. I've worked with the greatest directors in the world. I've earned respect from my peers and from audiences everywhere, and I'm not going to stand here and let you treat me like I'm nothing. Nobody said you're nothing, Gutfeld tried to backtrack. Come on, sit back down. Let's finish the interview. The interview's over, Samuel said flatly. He started walking toward the edge of the stage. The audience didn't know whether to applaud or stay quiet. Some people started clapping. Then more people joined in. Within seconds, half the audience was on their feet, applauding Samuel L. Jackson as he walked off. Gutfeld was left standing at his desk, looking completely lost. Okay, well, he said to the cameras, trying to laugh it off. That just happened. Guess we'll take a commercial break. But Samuel wasn't stopping. He walked past the cameras, past the crew, past the producers who were trying to figure out how to salvage this disaster. He walked straight to his dressing room, grabbed his things, and headed for the exit. Meanwhile, back on set, Gutfeld was scrambling. His producers were in his ear, probably telling him to apologize, to explain, to do something to fix this. But the damage was done. The entire interview had been a train wreck from start to finish, and it was entirely his fault. All right, Gutfeld said to the audience, holding up his hands. That got a little heated. But you know what? This is live television. Things happen. We have passionate conversations. That's what makes this show great. The audience wasn't buying it. You could see it on their faces. They'd just watched him spend 10 minutes insulting a beloved actor for no reason, and now he was trying to spin it like it was all part of the plan. One audience member actually shouted out, "You were rude!" Others nodded in agreement. Gutfeld tried to laugh it off. Hey, I ask tough questions. That's my job. If people can't handle it, maybe they shouldn't come on the show. But that excuse fell flat too. There's a difference between asking tough questions and being deliberately disrespectful. Everyone watching knew which one this was. Backstage, Samuel was talking to his publicist. I'm not doing this, he was saying. I'm not sitting there while some guy tries to make himself look clever at my expense. His publicist was nodding, completely understanding. You did the right thing. That was out of line. Damn right it was, Samuel agreed. Back in the studio, Gutfeld was trying to move on to the next segment, but the energy was completely wrong. The audience was still buzzing about what just happened. The crew looked uncomfortable. Even Gutfeld seemed rattled, though he was doing his best to hide it. Okay, coming up after the break, he said, reading from the teleprompter. We've got more guests, more discussion. Stay with us. But the reality was that nobody cared about what came next. The only thing anyone would remember from this episode was Samuel L. Jackson walking off. That moment when a respected actor had enough and refused to tolerate disrespect, even on live television. The commercial break started. Gutfeld slumped in his chair. His producers came over, and you could tell from their body language that this was a serious problem. This wasn't just an awkward moment. This was a publicity nightmare. A beloved actor, someone with millions of fans around the world, had just walked off their show because the host couldn't resist being condescending. In his dressing room, Samuel was already on the phone with his agent. Yeah, it went about as badly as it could, he was saying. Guy was a jerk from the first question. No, I'm not going back out there. Interview's done. His agent was probably asking if he was sure, if there was any way to smooth this over. But Samuel had made his decision. He'd been in the industry long enough to know when something wasn't worth his time. Look, Samuel continued, I've dealt with difficult interviews before. I've handled confrontational journalists. But this wasn't journalism. This was just some guy trying to make me look bad so he could feel important. And I'm not playing that game. Meanwhile, the show came back from commercial. Gutfeld had composed himself, put his smile back on, and was ready to continue like nothing had happened. Welcome back, he said to the camera. As you saw before the break, Samuel L. Jackson decided to leave. That's his choice. We wanted to have a real conversation, but apparently that was too much. He was still trying to spin it, still trying to make it seem like Samuel was the problem. But anyone who had watched the interview knew the truth. This wasn't about Samuel L. Jackson being unable to handle a tough conversation. This was about a host who crossed every line of basic respect and couldn't understand why his guest refused to tolerate it. The rest of the show continued, but it was a shadow of what it should have been. The other segments felt forced. The audience was distracted. Everyone was still thinking about what had happened earlier. Samuel L. Jackson, meanwhile, had left the building. He got into his car and drove away, probably relieved that he'd stood up for himself. He didn't owe anyone his time, especially not someone who was going to use that time to mock and belittle him. The interview itself had lasted maybe 10 minutes. 10 minutes that felt like an hour. 10 minutes that showed exactly what happens when a host forgets that respect is a two-way street. You can challenge your guests. You can ask difficult questions. But you can't just attack someone's life's work and expect them to sit there and smile about it. Gutfeld had made a calculation. He decided that being provocative was more important than being respectful. He'd gambled that he could poke and prod at a Hollywood legend, and it would make for good television. But he'd miscalculated badly. Because Samuel L. Jackson wasn't just some actor desperate for publicity. He was someone who'd earned his place in the industry through decades of hard work, and he wasn't about to let anyone diminish that. The question Gutfeld had opened with kept echoing. Do you ever get tired of playing the same kind of character over and over again? It was a loaded question, designed to put Samuel on the defensive from the start, and it had only gotten worse from there. Every follow-up had been another jab, another attempt to undermine and belittle. Comic book stuff, he'd said, like that was somehow less worthy. Like entertaining millions of people around the world was something to be ashamed of. Like being part of the biggest film franchise in history was selling out rather than being selected for your talent and professionalism. And then calling Samuel sensitive for pushing back. That was the classic move of someone who knows they've crossed a line, but doesn't want to admit it. Attack the person for their reaction instead of taking responsibility for your own actions. The audience had seen it all. They'd watched a respected actor come onto the show in good faith and get blindsided by hostility. They'd watched him try to respond professionally at first, giving thoughtful answers even when the questions were designed to provoke. And they'd watched him reach his breaking point when it became clear that respect wasn't on the table. That moment when Samuel stood up. That was the moment everyone would remember. Not the insults Gutfeld had thrown. Not the smug grin he'd worn while doing it. But the moment when someone said, "Enough," and walked away with their dignity intact. Because that's what it came down to. Dignity. Samuel L. Jackson had spent 40 years building a career, earning respect, proving himself over and over again. And he wasn't about to sacrifice his dignity for 10 more minutes of an interview that had already gone completely wrong. The walk-off stage had been powerful in its simplicity. No dramatic speech, no throwing things or making a scene. Just a calm, firm decision that this wasn't worth his time. And the audience had responded to that. They'd stood and applauded because they recognized someone standing up for themselves in the face of unnecessary disrespect. Gutfeld had tried to frame it as Samuel being unable to handle tough questions. But the questions weren't tough. They were insulting. There's a massive difference. A tough question makes you think. An insulting question just makes you wonder why the person asking it has so little respect for you. You show up, you say some lines, you cash a check. That's what Gutfeld had said, reducing decades of craft and commitment to nothing more than a transaction. As if acting was easy. As if anyone could do what Samuel L. Jackson does. As if the hours of preparation, the emotional investment, the physical demands of action roles, the nuance required for dramatic performances, as if all of that was nothing, and Samuel had called him on it. What have you actually done? What have you created? What have you built? Those questions had hit home because they exposed the hypocrisy. It's easy to sit behind a desk and criticize. It's much harder to actually do something worth criticizing. The show continued that night without its main guest. Gutfeld filled the time somehow, probably with his usual panel discussions and political commentary. But none of it mattered. The only thing people would talk about was the interview that exploded. In the days that followed, people would analyze every moment. They'd debate whether Samuel should have stayed and tried to turn the interview around. They'd question whether Gutfeld had planned the confrontation or if it had genuinely gotten away from him. They'd discuss what it means for the future of late-night television when respect seems to be optional. But in that moment, in the studio, with the cameras still rolling and the audience still processing what they'd just witnessed, there was only one truth. Samuel L. Jackson had come to do an interview. Greg Gutfeld had turned it into an ambush, and when pushed far enough, Samuel had made the only choice that made sense. He'd left. The final image of Samuel walking off that stage would become iconic, a reminder that no matter how famous someone is, no matter what platform they're given, respect is not negotiable. You can't demand that someone sit and accept being torn down just because there are cameras present. Gutfeld had learned that lesson the hard way. You can be edgy. You can be provocative. You can push boundaries, but you can't forget that the person sitting across from you is a human being who deserves basic dignity. And if you do forget, don't be surprised when they remind you by walking away. The crew started cleaning up after the show. The audience filed out, still talking about what they'd seen. And somewhere across town, Samuel L. Jackson was probably already forgetting about the whole thing, moving on to the next project, the next interview with someone who actually wanted to have a conversation, rather than a confrontation. Because that's the thing about people who've earned real respect. They don't need to prove anything. They've already done the work. They've already built the legacy. And they definitely don't need to sit and listen to someone who hasn't done a fraction of what they've accomplished. Try to tell them their career doesn't matter. The interview had started with such promise. Bright lights, enthusiastic audience, a major star walking out to promote his latest work. It should have been easy. It should have been fun. Instead, it became a case study in how not to treat your guests. Gutfeld's first mistake was assuming that being contrarian was the same as being interesting. His second mistake was thinking that Samuel L. Jackson would just absorb the insults and keep smiling. His biggest mistake was not recognizing when he'd gone too far and trying to walk it back before everything collapsed. But he didn't walk it back. He doubled down. He kept pushing. And he pushed a man who'd spent 4 decades in one of the toughest industries in the world. Someone who dealt with rejection and criticism and obstacles most people couldn't imagine. Someone who'd earned every bit of success through talent and perseverance. You don't push someone like that and expect them to just take it. You don't disrespect a legacy like that and think there won't be consequences. And the consequence was simple, immediate, and completely justified. Samuel L. Jackson walked off, and Greg Gutfeld was left looking exactly like what he was. Someone who'd gotten so caught up in trying to be clever that he'd forgotten how to be decent. The empty chair where Samuel had been sitting told the whole story, a conversation that never should have ended that way, an interview that could have been memorable for all the right reasons, but instead became memorable for all the wrong ones. A moment that showed the difference between confidence and arrogance, between challenging and attacking, between hosting and haranguing. As the studio lights dimmed and the last of the equipment was packed away, one thing was crystal clear. This wasn't going to be forgotten anytime soon. Not by the people in the audience who saw it live, not by the viewers who watched it home, and definitely not by anyone who believes that respect should be the foundation of every conversation, whether there are cameras present or not. Samuel L. Jackson had walked onto that stage as a guest. He'd walked off as someone who'd drawn a line and refused to let it be crossed. And in doing so, he'd reminded everyone watching that dignity isn't something you sacrifice for anyone, no matter how big their platform is. The interview was over. The confrontation was done. But the message would last much longer. Know your worth. Demand respect. And when someone shows you they're not willing to give it, walk away. Because some conversations aren't worth having, and some platforms aren't worth your time. That's what Samuel L. Jackson proved in just 32 seconds. The time it took for Greg Gutfeld to make one comment too many. The time it took for a professional actor to realize this wasn't an interview, it was an attack. The time it took to stand up, say enough, and walk off with his head held high. What happens when respect isn't given? You get a moment like this. A moment that defines both people involved. One as someone who stood up for himself. The other as someone who learned too late that you can't treat people poorly and expect them to stick around for the privilege. The empty guest chair said everything that needed to be said,